A CEO walked past 400 of the most powerful people in Chicago. Board members, investors, his own executives, to reach one woman standing alone by the windows. She was wearing a dress she'd ironed 3 times, because she couldn't afford another one. Her husband had told her 20 minutes earlier to stay out of sight. He had no idea that the man everyone in that room was waiting for had spent 9 years looking for exactly her. If you've ever felt invisible next to someone who was supposed to make you feel like everything, stay with me. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most powerful one in it. Welcome back to Tales Plot. Before we start, if stories like this one hit you somewhere real, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we post a new one every week. Now, let's go back to that October evening in Chicago. Emily Carter stood in front of her closet for almost 20 minutes that evening. Not because she had too many choices, because she only had one. A navy blue dress, 3 years old, ironed 3 separate times. Not because it needed it, but because ironing it gave her hands something to do while her stomach turned itself in knots. Tonight was important. Ryan had told her that much at least a dozen times that week. This isn't just a company dinner, he'd said, straightening his tie in the mirror for the 5th time. This is the night everything changes for me. Emily had smiled and told him she was proud of him. She meant it too. 6 years of marriage, and despite everything, some part of her still believed in the man she'd fallen in love with. The one who used to bring her grocery store flowers because he couldn't afford anything better, and told her it didn't matter because someday he'd make it up to her 100 times over. It hadn't always felt like this. A few weeks earlier, at a smaller work dinner, she'd made an offhand comment about a photo op, and Ryan had leaned over and murmured, "It's photo opportunity, Emily. Say it right in front of people like this." She'd laughed it off. Small thing. Everyone corrects everyone. Then, at his company's holiday party, a colleague had asked her name, and Ryan had simply said, "This is my wife," and moved on to the next handshake before anyone thought to ask what she was actually called. And just last month, over dinner with his manager, Emily had started telling a story about a boy at the library who taught himself to read using a picture dictionary, and Ryan had cut in halfway through, redirecting the table toward his quarterly numbers, as if her sentence had simply run out of importance partway through. None of it, on its own, was anything worth a fight over. That was the trouble with small cuts. Each one healed clean enough that you almost forgot it happened, until you added them up one quiet dinner at a time, and realized how much of yourself you'd learned to make smaller. Tonight, in the car, she found out what 6 years of those small cuts finally added up to. Ryan reached over at a red light and adjusted her collar, the way you'd straighten a picture frame. "When the new CEO arrives," he said, not quite looking at her. "Stand behind everyone. Toward the back." Emily blinked. "What?" "You heard me." He said it lightly, casually, as if he were reminding her to bring a jacket. "I don't want anyone thinking we're out of place," he added, glancing at her dress the way you'd glance at a stain. Something in Emily's chest went very quiet and very still. "And if someone asks what you do," Ryan continued, eyes back on the road, "just say you work in education." "I work at the library," Emily said softly. "I know. It sounds better. I've always been proud of my job." "I'm not saying you shouldn't be," he said, with the particular impatience of a man who has said something cruel and wants credit for not saying it more cruelly. "I'm saying tonight isn't the night to explain the county's summer reading program to a room full of CEOs. Emily said nothing. There are 2 kinds of pain in a marriage. The kind that arrives all at once like a slammed door, and the kind that arrives one small sentence at a time so quietly you don't notice you're bleeding until years later, when you finally count the cuts. Ryan had never once raised his voice at her. He didn't need to. If this is already making your chest tight, comment, "I felt that below we read everyone." The Grand Regency Hotel ballroom in downtown Chicago was the kind of room built to make ordinary people feel small. 40-foot ceilings. Crystal chandeliers dripping light across marble floors. A string quartet playing something delicate in the corner, barely audible over the low roar of hundreds of confident voices, all of them auditioning for each other. Emily had never felt comfortable in rooms like this. She'd always been better with books than with small talk, more at ease listening to a stranger's story than performing her own. Ryan kissed her forehead in the entrance. The kind of kiss meant for an audience, not for her, and whispered, "There. Now smile." She smiled. Not because she wanted to, but because after 6 years, she had learned that pretending to be fine was sometimes easier than explaining, again, why she wasn't. "Stay near the back," Ryan said, already scanning the room for people worth knowing. "I'll come find you after I've spoken to the executives." Then he walked away from her, into the crowd, and didn't look back once. He never saw her watching him go. He never saw the moment her shoulders dropped half an inch, the way they do when you stop holding a smile you don't mean anymore. Emily slipped quietly toward the restroom, found an empty stall of mirror space, and gripped the edge of the marble counter with both hands. She looked at herself for a long moment, the iron dress, the careful makeup, the smile she'd practiced in the car until it looked almost real. "Stand at the back," she whispered to her own reflection, testing the words out loud, as if saying them might make them hurt less. They didn't. Her eyes filled before she could stop them, and for a few seconds she let herself cry, silently, the way you learn to cry when you've spent years making sure no one hears you do it. "When did I become," she whispered, "someone my own husband is embarrassed to stand beside?" No one answered her because no one was there to. She ran the cold water, pressed a paper towel gently beneath her eyes, and fixed her mascara in the mirror. Then she straightened her shoulders, the way she always did, and walked back out to find a quiet corner of the ballroom where nobody would look at her twice. She had no way of knowing that, in less than an hour, that would be the last time in her life anyone ever overlooked her. Emily found her way to the tall windows at the edge of the ballroom, overlooking a glittering, sprawling Chicago skyline. It was quieter there, safer. She'd always preferred the edges of rooms to the centers of them. 12 years at the Lincoln Community Library had taught her something most people in this ballroom would never learn even after a lifetime of galas. Everyone is carrying something invisible. The exhausted single mother, checking out picture books at closing time because it was the only 20 minutes of quiet she got all day. The widower who came in every Tuesday for the same mystery novels his late wife used to read aloud to him. The little boy, she thought of him often, who once tugged her sleeve and whispered, "Miss Emily, books are the only place where my parents don't fight." People assumed librarians shelved books. Emily knew the truth. Sometimes they shelved broken hearts. "Mind if I join you?" Emily turned. An elegant, silver-haired woman stood beside her. Holding a glass of champagne, she didn't seem particularly interested in drinking. "Of course," Emily said. "You don't seem terribly interested in networking," the woman observed, not unkindly. Emily laughed, a small, honest laugh. "I'm better with books than with business. I don't think importance has much to do with titles." The woman studied her for a moment, then smiled. A small, private smile, as if Emily had just confirmed something she already suspected. "I couldn't agree more." Before either of them could say anything else, the ballroom lights dimmed. The chairman of Kingston Technologies took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for what promises to be a historic evening." Applause rolled through the room like a wave. As many of you know, our board conducted a worldwide search for someone capable of leading Kingston Technologies into its next chapter. Across the room, Ryan straightened his jacket and pushed gently toward the front of the crowd. This was it. One handshake. One sentence that landed just right. That was all he needed tonight to change the next 10 years of his career, and he had rehearsed it in the car, in the elevator, in the bathroom mirror. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks." Ryan Carter, Regional Sales Director. "It's an honor to." "It is my great honor," the chairman continued, "to introduce our new Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Daniel Brooks." The ballroom erupted. The massive oak doors at the far end of the room swung open, and Daniel Brooks walked in, tall, composed, wearing a black suit tailored with the kind of precision that costs more than most people's cars. Photographers surged forward. Board members hurried to form a receiving line. Every person in that ballroom who had spent the evening performing confidence suddenly had somewhere urgent to be, right next to him. Ryan straightened his shoulders and rehearsed his line one final time in his head. But something was wrong. Daniel barely registered the first handshake. He nodded politely, shook another hand, then another, but his eyes weren't on the executives in front of him. His eyes were searching the room, slowly, carefully, almost desperately, like a man who had spent years imagining this exact moment and was terrified of getting it wrong. The room began to notice. Conversations thinned out. A photographer lowered his camera, unsure what to point it at anymore. Daniel kept walking, past vice presidents, past major investors, past the chairman himself, past Ryan. Ryan's rehearsed smile froze on his face. He turned, confused, trying to see where the new CEO of the company was actually going, because it clearly wasn't toward anyone important. Daniel walked all the way to the back of the ballroom, to the windows, where a woman in a navy blue dress stood quietly, holding a glass of sparkling water, trying to take up as little space as her husband had asked her to. For one full second, neither of them moved. Then Daniel's eyes went wide. His breathing caught audibly. His hands, the same hands that had signed billion-dollar mergers without so much as a tremor, began to shake. Emily? She stared at him, older, more composed, but unmistakably the same person. Daniel? His face broke into the kind of smile you only see once or twice in a lifetime, pure, involuntary relief. I knew it, he said, shaking his head slowly. I knew that one day I'd find you. And then, without a single thought for who was watching, he stepped forward and pulled her into an embrace. The ballroom went completely silent. Somewhere near the front, a champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the marble floor. Every head in the room turned toward the sound, then toward the two of them. Ryan stood frozen, his own fingers still curled in the shape of the glass he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He couldn't understand it. The most powerful man in the building, the man every single person in that room had spent the whole evening trying to get 30 seconds with, had walked past every one of them, just to hug his wife. Daniel stepped back, still holding her by the shoulders, still looking at her like she was something he'd been afraid didn't exist anymore. I never stopped looking for you, he said. If you want to know what happens next, stay with me. This is where the real story starts. For several long seconds, nobody in that ballroom moved. Emily searched Daniel's face, trying to reconcile the composed billionaire in front of her with the exhausted, brilliant graduate student she remembered, the one who used to run on coffee and stubbornness and impossible ideas. You really found me, she whispered. I promised myself, Daniel said, his eyes still wet, that if you were anywhere in this world, I would find you. Whispers rippled outward through the crowd like water finding the cracks in a floor. Who is she? Did they work together? Was she part of one of his old companies? Ryan felt every single whisper like a blade between his ribs. 15 minutes earlier, he had asked his own wife to make herself invisible. Now she was the only thing anyone in that room could talk about. Daniel finally seemed to register the hundreds of stunned faces around them. He cleared his throat, a little embarrassed. I suppose I've shocked everyone, he said, and a few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Then his eyes went straight back to Emily. Would you mind waiting until after dinner? There are things I've wanted to say to you for a very long time. Emily hesitated. I don't know. Please. No pressure in his voice, only hope. After a moment, she nodded. I'll stay. Ryan pushed through the crowd wearing the smile that had gotten him through a decade of corporate small talk and slid his arm around his wife's waist like a man reclaiming territory. Mr. Brooks, he said, extending his hand. Ryan Carter, Emily's husband. Daniel shook his hand, politely, professionally, and released it almost instantly, his attention already back on Emily. As I said, Daniel continued, I hope you'll give me a few minutes after dinner. I will, Emily said. The chairman gently interrupted, reminding Daniel that the entire ballroom was still waiting on his opening remarks. Daniel nodded and before walking to the stage, looked back at Emily one final time, not with surprise this time, but with something closer to relief. The kind of relief you feel after searching for something precious for far, far too long. Ryan didn't speak again until they reached their table. Then, without looking at her, he whispered one word. Explain. Emily kept her eyes on the stage. Not now. Then when? After tonight. His jaw tightened. You've known him this whole time? No, Emily said quietly. I haven't seen Daniel in almost 10 years. I honestly believed I never would again. Daniel stepped behind the podium, and the ballroom rose into applause. He thanked the board, the employees, the shareholders. He spoke, briefly and gracefully, about innovation and integrity and building a company where people mattered more than titles. Then, just before closing, he paused. I've learned something in my career, he said. The room quieted. Success isn't measured only by what you build. It's measured by the people who helped you become who you are. His eyes moved slowly across the room. They stopped on Emily. There are people whose kindness changes your life forever, he said. And sometimes, you don't realize how much they gave up until they're gone. Nobody else in that room understood what he meant. Emily did. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, because she knew exactly which memory had just crossed his mind. A small university lab. Stacks of notebooks. Cold pizza boxes stacked 3 high. Daniel pacing in circles, practically vibrating with excitement, while she sat quietly behind a laptop screen, correcting the parts of his enthusiasm that weren't quite grounded in reality yet. We actually did it, he'd shouted once years ago. Don't celebrate yet, she'd laughed. We still have to prove it works. It works because you wrote it. You solved the impossible part. I just convinced everyone else it mattered. Neither of them had known, that night, that life was about to pull them into 2 entirely different futures. The memory dissolved as applause rippled through the ballroom again. Dinner was served. Executives returned to their conversations. But every few minutes, someone's eyes drifted toward the woman at the back table who, an hour earlier, nobody could have picked out of a crowd. The invisible woman had become the most talked about person in the room. Ryan noticed it too. People who had walked past Emily all evening now smiled politely as they passed their table. He should have felt proud. Instead, for the first time in years, Ryan Carter felt completely invisible. We're about halfway through tonight's story. If you're enjoying it, drop a comment with one word, stay. It helps more than you'd think. About an hour later, as dessert plates were being cleared, Daniel approached their table again. Emily, would you come with me for a few minutes? Ryan stood immediately. I'll come too. Daniel's smile stayed polite, but firm. I'd actually like to speak with Emily alone. The sentence landed on Ryan like a stone dropped from a height. Of course, he said, forcing the smile back onto his face. Together, Daniel and Emily stepped out onto a quiet terrace overlooking the Chicago River, the noise of the ballroom fading behind the glass doors. For a while, neither of them spoke. You still wear your mother's necklace, Daniel finally said. Emily's hand went instinctively to the small silver pendant at her throat. I never take it off. I remember. She looked at him, surprised. You remember that? I remember more than you think. A breeze carried the distant hum of traffic up from the street below. Daniel took a slow breath. When you disappeared, he said, I thought you were angry with me. Angry? Emily looked genuinely shocked. You left without saying goodbye. I didn't trust myself to say goodbye, she said softly. Daniel frowned. I don't understand. You will. Just not tonight. He nodded slowly. I've waited 9 years. I can wait one more day. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a worn, leather-bound notebook. Emily froze. No, it can't be. I've kept it this whole time, he said, smiling. Her hands trembled as she took it. The faded initials on the cover were unmistakable. EP. Inside were pages of sketches, handwritten equations, half-formed business ideas, and dreams she had believed she'd left behind for good. A single folded note slipped out from between the pages and landed at her feet. Emily picked it up and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was her own from nearly 10 years earlier. At the bottom of the page, 6 words. Some dreams are worth sacrificing for. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She had no idea that, by the next morning, the entire company would learn exactly what she had sacrificed, and why the most powerful man in that building believed he owed everything to the quiet woman her own husband had asked to stand at the back. The drive home was silent except for rain tapping against the windshield. Ryan kept both hands on the wheel. Finally, he spoke. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily watched the blurred city lights slide past her window. "You never asked." "I asked about your past. You asked where I grew up. I answered. You asked about college. I told you I studied computer science. You never mentioned building a company with Daniel Brooks." "Because we never built a company," Emily said. "We built an idea. They're not the same thing." Ryan laughed, bitter and short. "Apparently they are, once it turns into a billion-dollar business." Emily didn't answer. After a while, quietly, she said, "Ryan, if I tell you everything tomorrow, will you promise to listen before you judge me?" He hesitated. "I'll try." "I hope so," she said, looking back out the window. That night, Ryan couldn't sleep. Once Emily had drifted off, exhausted from the evening, he crept into the living room with his laptop and typed one name into a search bar. Emily Parker. Hundreds of results. Most irrelevant. Then, buried on the fourth page, a decade-old article loaded slowly on his screen. Two young graduate students stood beside a research display. One was unmistakably Daniel Brooks. The other was Emily, younger, laughing, confident in a way Ryan realized, with a small jolt, he had genuinely never once seen in 6 years of marriage. The headline read, "Graduate Research Team Wins National Innovation Challenge." The article called Daniel a gifted entrepreneur. It called Emily the technical architect behind the project's breakthrough predictive software. Ryan opened another article, then another. Each mentioned Daniel prominently and Emily briefly, until, abruptly, her name simply disappeared from the record, as if she had stepped out of her own history. "What happened to you?" Ryan whispered to an empty room. Across the city, in a dark office with the skyline stretching out beyond the windows, Daniel Brooks sat alone with an old, yellowed envelope in his hands. Emily's handwriting covered the front. "To Daniel, only if I never come back." He had never opened it. Not once in 9 years. He'd made himself a promise. If he ever found her again, she would decide whether it should finally be read. The search itself had never really stopped. In the early years, before Helix Dynamics had made him wealthy enough to do it properly, he'd spent weekends combing through university alumni records for any trace of an Emily Parker. Later, once he could afford it, he'd quietly hired a private investigator, the first of 3 over the years, each one eventually reporting the same dead end. He tracked down 2 of their old professors, both retired, neither of whom had heard from her since graduation. For a while he'd funded small library grants in cities across the Midwest, half hoping, half embarrassed by his own hope, that someone somewhere might mention a librarian who matched the description he could never quite stop carrying in his head. Nothing ever came of any of it. He'd simply refused to let that mean nothing ever would. He placed the envelope carefully back in his desk drawer. Tomorrow, the truth would finally come into the light. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that the story the world believed about his success had only ever been half the story, and the missing half belonged to the quiet woman who had spent an entire evening standing at the back of a crowded room, believing the world had forgotten her. The next morning, as Emily prepared to leave for Kingston Technologies, she opened her front door to find a black luxury car already waiting at the curb. The driver stepped out. "Good morning, Miss Carter. Mr. Brooks asked me to bring you to headquarters." Emily looked at the car, then back at the house, and felt, quietly and certainly, that by the end of the day nothing in her life would be the same again. Ryan watched from the living room window. Neither of them had slept much. As she reached the door, he spoke. "Can I ask you one thing?" She turned. "If the company had made it back then, would you have stayed?" Emily thought about it for a long moment. Then she smiled sadly. "No." Ryan looked genuinely surprised. "You wouldn't have?" "My little brother had just lost both our parents," she said. "He needed someone to make breakfast, to help with homework, to tell him everything would be all right." She paused. "No amount of money was more important than that." Ryan lowered his eyes. For the first time, he understood that the woman he had quietly spent years calling unambitious had made a sacrifice he wasn't at all sure he could have made himself. Kingston Technologies was already buzzing by the time Emily arrived. Employees stopped mid-sentence as she crossed the lobby. Daniel met her at the private elevator before anyone else could. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I almost didn't." "I know," he said, laughing softly. "You always needed a little encouragement." Upstairs, nearly every board member was already seated. Ryan arrived moments later and noticed an empty chair beside Daniel with a nameplate reading, "Emily Carter, guest." His stomach tightened. Daniel welcomed the room, then said, "Most of you know me as the founder who built Helix Dynamics. But today, I'd like to tell you the story that never made the newspapers." He placed the old leather notebook gently on the table in front of Emily. "It belonged to the person who challenged every idea I ever had, and improved every single one of them. When investors first met us, they assumed I was the technical genius." He smiled. "They were wrong. She wrote the code. She solved the impossible problems. When everyone else gave up, she stayed until sunrise. Without Emily Parker, there would never have been a Helix Dynamics." The room sat in stunned silence. A director finally raised a hand. "If that's true, why has no one ever heard her name?" Daniel looked at Emily. "If you're comfortable, I think they deserve to hear it from you." Emily stood slowly. She had never enjoyed speaking to rooms full of strangers. But this story had stayed hidden long enough. "My father suffered a stroke," she said, her voice calm. 3 days later, my mother was killed in a car accident. My brother was 12. There were no grandparents, no aunts, no uncles, no one else. A few people lowered their heads. I had 2 choices. I could stay and chase the company we dreamed about, or I could become a parent to a frightened little boy. She paused. I chose my brother. I signed every document Daniel put in front of me. I transferred my ownership. I packed 1 suitcase. And I left. Ryan felt his chest tighten. Not because she had left, but because in 6 years of marriage, she had never once told him she regretted it. Daniel stood. "For years, I believed I'd failed her." "You didn't," Emily said. "I chose. You just failed to find me afterward." He opened a small wooden box on the table, revealing a yellowed envelope. "You told me to read this only if we never met again." He handed it to her. "We're meeting again. I think it belongs to you." Emily broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter. She read it silently, hands trembling, 1 tear sliding down her cheek before she folded it again. "What did it say?" Daniel asked. Emily smiled through her tears. "I told you not to wait for me." She laughed gently. "And knowing you, I should have known you wouldn't listen." "That," Daniel said, "was the one promise I refused to keep. If you've made it this far, you already know the story is about to hit somewhere deep. Don't skip the ending." Daniel wasn't finished. He slid 1 more folder across the table. "For 9 years, my attorneys have managed a trust that has never been activated. I created it the day I realized I might never find you. This doesn't erase the years you lost. It doesn't repay the sacrifices you made. But it finally acknowledges the truth." Inside the folder was a letter, not from a lawyer, but from Daniel himself. Emily read it quietly. That every award he'd ever accepted had felt incomplete. That every success carried her fingerprints. That this wasn't a gift, only her name being returned to the place it had always belonged. Across the table, Ryan sat frozen. For years, he had believed ambition made people strong. Now he understood something different. Sacrifice made people unforgettable. He stood. "Emily, I owe you more than an apology." Every eye in the room turned toward him. "When we met, I admired your kindness," he said, his voice shaking. "Somewhere along the way, I became ashamed of the very qualities that made me fall in love with you. I measured success by titles. I measured people by income. And I measured you by everything that never mattered." He looked directly at her. "When I asked you to stand at the back last night, I wasn't protecting my career. I was exposing my own insecurity. I'm deeply sorry." Emily walked toward him slowly. For a brief moment, he believed she might forgive him. Instead, she took his hand gently. You know what hurt the most? It wasn't that you underestimated me. It was that you stopped seeing me. She paused. I kept waiting for the man who used to bring me flowers from the grocery store because he couldn't afford a florist. I kept waiting for the man who once told me, no matter what happens, we'll always stand beside each other. But somewhere along the way, you started worrying more about standing in front of people than standing beside your wife. Ryan had no answer because she was right. She removed her wedding ring, looked at it for a long moment, and placed it gently in his trembling hand. I don't hate you, she said. I never will. But love cannot survive where respect has disappeared. She smiled sadly. I hope one day you become the man I believed you were. There was no anger in the room, no shouting, only a quiet, settled peace. 3 months later, the Parker Foundation opened its doors across Chicago, scholarships for children who had lost parents, funding for community libraries, support for young innovators whose lives had handed them impossible burdens too early. Emily insisted every building include a library. Books gave me hope when life gave me grief, she liked to say. Daniel remained a trusted friend and advisor. Nothing more. Their bond had always been built on respect and shared dreams, never romance. And somehow, that truth surprised people more than the reveal ever had. Ryan resigned from Kingston Technologies, not because anyone asked him to, but because every morning through those doors reminded him of the woman he'd failed to appreciate. He eventually took a job with a nonprofit helping unemployed workers rebuild their careers. For the first time in years, his work wasn't about status. It was about people. One crisp autumn afternoon, Emily visited the community library where she'd worked for over a decade. The children ran to her the moment she walked in. Miss Emily, are you reading today? I wouldn't miss it, she laughed, settling into her old chair by the window. Outside, reporters waited for interviews she had no intention of giving. Because the small faces gathered around her mattered more than any camera ever could. Years earlier, she had believed she'd lost everything. Now she understood the truth. She had never once lost the part of herself that actually mattered. Kindness, integrity, compassion. Those were the only things nobody could ever take from her, and they had quietly led her back to a life richer than she'd ever imagined. Sometimes, the people the world overlooks are exactly the people who go on to change it. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. What do you think hurt Ryan the most? Losing Emily, or realizing too late who she'd always been? If you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next unforgettable story from Tales Plot. And remember, never make someone you love stand at the back of the room just to help yourself stand at the front. The right person will always make space for you beside them. See you in the next story.